Hi everybody, my name's Matthew Shepherd. I am the Director of Communications and Outreach here at the Xerces Society. I have been with the Society for very nearly 20 years now, and the first job that I was doing here was working on pollinator conservation, and was in the very lucky opportunity to begin to build our program, but I've moved on from there. I wanted to give you an introduction to how to identify bees. This can be a very complicated thing, and I hope that at the end of this video you will not be scratching your head and completely confused. Working with bees has been a fantastic thing for me because it has really allowed me to engage directly with individuals, and that's something that in my career I particularly loved. The chance to try and understand more how people see their environment and how they engage with it, and the way they perceive it as well, and how they think about it. And bees is one of those really intriguing things, because if I were to say to you, think of a bee, there's a pretty good chance you'll probably think of a fluffy yellow and black striped insect. And if I were to ask you to draw a bee, you'd probably draw something similar, but you'd almost certainly have honeycomb in it somewhere, those classic hexagonal shapes. And that's why I like this cartoon from the Bizarro collection, because it encapsulates so many of those things. The bees are striped, they're honeycomb in the background, and yet this is really doesn't represent the reality of bees. We're also exposed to bees at a very early stage in our lives. All around us when we're young, you'll get little plush toys, you'll get animals for the kids to play with and chew on, you get kids' books with images. And I like this one because if I were an illustrator of a book involving teddy bears or ponies or puppies, and you drew the animals as badly as this one is drawn, you'd probably get sacked. There's some really good things about this drawing of a bee, and it also allows us to start talking about the anatomy of bees. So bees, the good things in this include the fact that they have 6 legs. Insects have 6 legs, as do bees. Bees in particular have 2 pairs of wings, and so you can see there's the front pair and the hind wings, so that's really great for this drawing. And also bees have these long and bent antennae. They don't wiggle quite like that, but that's not too bad. Unfortunately, where this one begins to fail is that bees have 3 major body parts. They have the head, they have a thorax, and then the abdomen, whereas this drawing only gives them 2 major body parts. And then we won't worry too much about the face, because bees really don't have a big red nose and smile at you. When we start talking about the number of species of bees in this country, sometimes it blows people's minds. There are about 3,600 species of bees. It's just a few over that, but roughly 3,600 species of bees in the United States and Canada. Looking at the West Coast in particular, California has something like 1,600 species of bees, and maybe the most diverse state for bees in the country. Where we are, based in Oregon, no one's entirely sure, but the best guess is around about 600 species, maybe 800 species of bees. And then in a garden, you can have dozens, 20, 30 species. It wouldn't be that unusual. My own garden, and I'm geekier than most people, so I notice these things. My own garden has more than 30 species of bees in it, and it's not a large plot at all. Given that diversity within that 3,600 species, you're going to get bees of all sorts of different sizes. And this photograph shows the smallest species of bee in North America, which is one in the genus Perdita, and is only about 2 millimeters long, so about 1/12 of an inch in length. And it's on top of the face of the largest species of bee in North America, which is a species of Carpenter bee from the southwest desert areas, and that one can actually be an inch and a quarter, maybe a little longer. Something else that's good to know when we start trying to identify bees, a very easy way to separate out major groups of bees, is how do they carry the pollen. Many of the bees, certainly honeybees, which we think of as being a classic bee, and this bumblebee that's here, you can see the pollen is carried on the rear leg as this wet lump. You can probably picture what the leg's like. You've probably seen many photographs of this, but the leg is very wide, and it has a fringe of very stiff hairs that allows the bees to mix the pollen with nectar and then pack it in and make sure it doesn't fall out. And that structure is called a curbicula, if you want a fancy word. The majority of bees are carrying dry pollen, and so they just have a patch of stiff hairs somewhere on their body. This longhorn bee has this really bushy rear leg with a lot of hairs. You can see the yellow color is the pollen it's got pushed in between those hairs. Some of the bees have stiff hairs on the underside of their abdomen. Some of them, it's almost like right up in their armpits almost, where they're carrying the pollen. And so they're carrying the pollen dry. And when you begin to start looking more at bees and you begin to get an eye for these things, you'll very quickly be able to pick out where the bee carries the pollen, and that will give you a really good hint as to what kind of bee it is. Bees are not wasps, and wasps are not bees. They are taxonomically, when you look at the science, they are very closely related. They're the same order, the Hymenoptera. But the wasps are quite different. If you were to look more closely, one of the more obvious things is that bees are hairier. This is one reason why they're very good at carrying pollen, because they have all these hairs. They also will have a specific structure on them somewhere for carrying pollen. The bee we have here, you can see again it's got this patch of very long stiff hairs on its back leg that it carries pollen. Wasps, often they're just described as looking meaner, which is a bit rough on wasps because they're not that mean really. But they don't have as many hairs. Their legs or some other part of their body are not adapted for carrying pollen, so you'll see the legs are very spindly and skinny compared to these much fatter, hairier legs. Many of them fold their wings lengthways when they're at rest. It appear to have these very narrow wings and spread out, as opposed to the wings that are closed over the back of the bee. Another insect that bees are sometimes confused with are flies. And there's a good reason for that, because flies have adapted to look more like a bee or a wasp for protection. If you're a bird, you're going to learn fairly quickly that a wasp will hurt, and you don't want to get hurt again. So you may find a fly that looks like a wasp you're just going to avoid. When you look more closely at bees and flies, you'll see that there are some things that are quite different. Again, bees are generally hairier and will have the structures on their body for carrying pollen. Their antennae are longer and bent, elbowed, often pointing down like that. And you see here on the fly, has a very small antennae right there right on the front of its face. You also look at the head and you see that flies have very big eyes and often meeting nearly on the top, whereas bees, their main eyes, their compound eyes, are just off on the side of their heads. The other thing that will separate a bee from a bee from a fly, and you'll often hear people talking about the number of wings. Bees have 4 wings, as I mentioned earlier, and flies only have 2. But to be perfectly honest, unless you get up close, you're not going to see how many wings a fly or a bee has. So the best way for you to separate them out is to look at the head, look for the antennae, look for the size of the eyes. I love this. Not many people would have quite such a happy smile on their face if they had 1,000 bees crawling on their chin. Honeybees are the stereotypical bee, the one that most people will think of. They'll think of queens and castes and honey and honeycomb and all those thousands of workers in the nest. Honeybees are not at all typical bees. This is a very unusual behavior and social structure to have in bees. And it's also the only bee that you can make a beard out of. And I'm now going to move on, and I will talk more about specific groups and help you identify out from one bee from another that you might find in your backyard. So I'm now going to show you a series of slides and try and talk about some of the groups of bees that you're most likely to encounter. With this, we're not going to be able to get to species level. We're going to be talking about fairly broad groups of bees, but most of the time that's all you need. The other reason for not trying to get into species level is because there are so many hundreds and thousands of species. It's almost impossible to separate them out to species level by eye. You often need a specimen under a microscope, and not many people like doing that, so we try and avoid that too. The honeybee, again, I'm starting with this one because it's the one that comes to mind. It's how we often picture a bee to look. The honeybee carries the pollen as a wet lump on the back leg, so that's a fairly easy thing to look for, a first thing to cue you in. They are striped. You can see all of these are striped, and but they do come in a range of different colors. They're not black and yellow like so many of the cartoons. They range in color from very dark brown through to a kind of golden brown color, but you will see that they do consistently have stripes. They're also their body shape, people often refer to it as torpedo shaped. It is this fairly fat shaped body, and so all of these things help you to identify as a honeybee. In terms of length, there'll be anything that they're typically not much more than 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch in length. A bee that at first glance may look like a honeybee are the mining bees. They are brown, they're bee-like, they're a similar size to honeybees, but one of the things that you'll first look at the legs. These have very hairy legs. They're not carrying pollen as a wet lump, they're carrying the dry pollen, so that's a very easy way to separate them out from honeybees. This is one that if you see one with a lot of pollen, they'll have pollen all the way up the legs and onto the back of their thorax. So it looks almost like they're carrying the pollen right up there in the armpits, if they had armpits. One thing about these bees that helps you identify them is that they're out very early. They're one of the first bees to be emerging in the year. So if you start seeing willow trees blooming, you're probably going to start finding mining bees. They will be out in middle of February in many areas, sometimes earlier. Another very similar bee are the sweat bees. These are very common. There's not many species. There's only about 10 species in North America, but they all look pretty much like this, drab, nondescript. One of the differences between the sweat bees and the mining bees, as hopefully you can see from this, the sweat bees are just not as hairy. Mining bees have a lot more hair on their thorax and their head. If you really want to get up close, you can also see on the sweat bees, they do have these bands of very short hair that give them the color on the back. And if you look, you'll see that the bands of hair are on the outer edge of the segments of that part of their body. The reason why they're called sweat bees is because they will come and they will land on people and they will try and lap up the sweat from you because they want the salts. Another type of sweat bee, and again, with the common names for bees, there aren't that many common names. So sometimes we have a common name like sweat bee and it might cover dozens, possibly even hundreds of different species. But within the group of sweat bees, there's the genus called Lasioglossum, and these are tiny, tiny. If you see one that's more than 1/4 of an inch long, it's a pretty big one. And often all you see are these little specks flying around, and you may not notice they're bees or recognize them as bees because they don't quite fit the image of yellow and black stripes and fat and hairy. But they are, well, it's difficult to describe them because there's not that much distinction about them. They're dark, they're kind of shiny, they're tiny. This one, you can have a sense, hopefully if you can see the detail in the photograph, you see how big the grains of pollen are compared to the bee itself. But again, carrying the pollen there on the back legs as a dry powder. These are often the bees, these metallic green sweat bees are the ones that catch people's attention and entrance them because they are stunningly beautiful. They're also surprisingly common, so you won't, you're unlikely to not see these in a summer. They are just vibrant, metallic, emerald green. Often they have gold overtones to them, and they're just stunningly beautiful creatures. In terms of size, they may be about as long as a honeybee, but they are more slender. They don't have that the same fatness to their abdomen, and they carry the pollen on the hind leg as a dry powder again. Moving on to a different bee family now. Megachile is the scientific name for this genus. They're commonly known as leafcutter bees, and that's because when they're making their nests, and they will nest in an existing tunnel in an old snag, they'll also nest in bee blocks in backyards or bamboo canes, anywhere they can find with a tunnel of the right diameter. They make the brood cells by neatly cutting little pieces of leaf and then stitching those together. And so that's where they get their names. One of the most distinctive features of the leafcutter bees is they carry their pollen on the underside of their abdomen. So you can see these hairs are brown. There's not necessarily they all have brown hair. Often you notice that because there'd be a bright yellow pollen packed into it, or white, whatever color of the plant. But they do have this very distinctive, very hairy underside to their abdomen. The mason bees, you probably have encountered mason bees. They've become a backyard bee of choice for many people. You can buy mason bee blocks. You can even buy mason bees themselves, and we don't really encourage you to buy the mason bees. We'd much prefer you to create the nesting site and then have the mason bees occupy it. First glance, number of times, I can't tell you how many times we've had people say, "We've got these flies, what's going on?" They do look kind of like a housefly. At first glance, they are dark color. They often have a blue metallic sheen to them, sometimes green. In size, they can be about as long as a honeybee. They're often fatter though. They have a much rounder body to them. And like the leafcutter bees, these mason bees have long hairs on the underside of their abdomen for carrying the pollen. So they don't have any structures on their legs. And as you can see from the photograph, this is sealing a nest in a bamboo cane, and it's using mud that is collected. This is why they're called mason bees. It's because they make these masonry walls to seal the nest and to separate the brood cells in the nest. Carder bees. This is another bee that's not native. We try to only really focus on native bees, but the honeybee is not native, but you're going to encounter it. Carder bees are a bee that you will find, particularly in gardens. The majority of the carder bees that you find in gardens are not native. This is a photograph from my own garden, and this is the non-native, the European species that's established. They are a member of the leafcutter bee family, so again, they're going to carry the pollen on stiff hairs on the underside of their abdomen. The reason why they're called carder bees is because they collect these fine downy plant hairs, and they use those to separate the brood cells and seal the nest in their cells. And so often you will see little strips and little bare patches on plants where they've stripped off the downy hairs. Another thing that you might find out about these bees are the males are very territorial, and some people have referred to them as headbutter bees, because they will anything that comes into their territory, which the males are in there hoping the female will turn up, and the males will defend that territory, and so they will chase other bees or other insects out, and they'll even confront humans. And it has happened to me because they live in my yard just outside my front door, and you're going in and out, and suddenly there'll be this bee hovering right in front of your face. And some people find that a little bit intimidating, but the good thing is that, like all male bees, the male carder bees don't have a stinger, so they're not going to hurt you. The reason they're called headbutter bees is because they have been known to headbutt people on the forehead. Not happened to me, but it does occur. Moving on to a different bee family now. These are the longhorn bees, and there are several genera of bees that we refer to as longhorn bees, and they get their name. They have these very long antennae. These are the males that have the very long antennae, and so they're known as longhorn bees because of that feature. In terms of overall look, they're about the same size as a honeybee. They're 0.7, maybe 3/4 of an inch in length, although they can be a lot smaller. They will have very hairy back legs. The females will have very hairy back legs, which they pack into the pollen into. In fact, the photograph I showed earlier when talking about whether they have wet lump or dry, that was another type of longhorn bee, a female longhorn bee, and you can remember it looked a bit like they were carrying cotton candy back from the county fair or something. They just have a huge, great scoper, massive, great back hairy leg. This is a bee that people often don't recognize as a bee because it isn't very hairy. It's not very big. People often think it's a fly or a wasp. But these are the small carpenter bees. They're ubiquitous. You find them in a lot of different areas. The ones we have here in the Pacific Northwest are mostly this metallic bottle green color, but you will also find them a fairly distinctive blue in other parts of the country. They are small. They don't get to much more than 1/2 inch long for a really big one, but most of them are much smaller than that, 1/4 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch, that kind of length. They are slightly unusual for bees because they often carry pollen in their crop. So they partially swallow the pollen to carry it back to the nest. But you also find they do have some hairs on their hind leg, and so you'll find they often have a small amount of pollen on their back leg. Bumblebees, these are the cute hairy ones. These are the ones that many people first try and draw. If you try to draw a bee or draw something that's round and hairy and striped. And that's pretty much what bumblebees are. They're round and hairy and striped. We often think of bumblebees as being yellow and black, but you will find them with orange. This particular species has just an orange tail. There are others that have a really distinct orange band on them. The bumblebees are one of the few groups of bees that we can identify to species just by looking at them from the color markings, and that makes them great, which is one reason why we have the Bumblebee Watch program, because it's something that people can very easily identify at sight or from a photograph. The other thing that marks them out is they have, and this one doesn't carry pollen, it's obviously collecting nectar on this trip, but they have the corbicula, this broad back leg with the long stiff hairs around it, where they carry their pollen. So they carry pollen as a wet lump. They can be small, or less than 1/2 inch long. They can be well over an inch long, and that depends upon the type of bee and often the time of year. The bumblebee, the queen overwinters and founds a new colony in the spring, and the first offspring from that colony will be very small because she's doing all the work and she's not able to feed them, and so they don't get so much nutrition. But then through the year, successive generations get bigger and bigger, and so the size doesn't have any great significance other than that in the spring you're likely to see small bumblebees, and they get generally larger through the year. The last group of bees I want to touch on are cuckoo bees, and this is a little tricky because it's difficult to identify them, because cuckoo bees are a group unified by a behavior, i.e. they're cuckoos. They don't make their own nest. They find the nest of a related bee, and they will sneak in whilst that female bee is away from the nest, lay their egg, and then creep away. And so it's that behavior that unites them, but you may well encounter them as you go along. And so there are some, this is one of the sweat bees, genus is Xerces. It looks a lot like a sweat bee, but it has this reddish brown abdomen. This one is called Coleoxys, and it's actually a leaf cutter, but it doesn't collect pollen because it doesn't have to feed anybody, and so there's no stiff hairs underneath the abdomen. The one on the lower left is a nomada, and these are tiny, and often this is one of the more frequently encountered ones in my experience. And one of the things that stands out a little bit is that their antennae always seem really thick, a bit like antelope horns at times, because they're often sticking up. But that's not necessarily the case with all of them, but it's something to look out for. And then there's also these other ones that are much bigger, because some of these can be almost an inch long. I don't have it illustrated here, but some of the cuckoo bees are in fact bumblebees, so they're parasitizing bumblebee nests, and so they'll be as big and look like any other bumblebee. But then they do come, and they can be confusing because they look a bit like bees, but don't quite look like bees. But just wanted to introduce you to the idea that not all bees are busy like bees. Some of them are lazy, can't be bothered to make their own nest. In this few minutes, it was just a very general introduction to identifying bees, and I realize that you may well be sitting there scratching your head and confused already. There are some lovely books out there now that can help. One of them is Attracting Native Pollinators. There is a section in it that helps you identify bees by general groups and goes into many more groups than we've covered here in this video. The book that I would recommend to anybody who really wants to get into identifying bees is this one called The Bees in Your Backyard. It's a fantastic book with great illustrations and some really well constructed identification keys that will help you separate out all these different bees. And then if you want to know more about bees in general, there's Thor Hansen's book Buzz is just a great read that will provide you a lot of background on bees and bee behavior and the people who are involved with bees. And there is also a short guide to bee families at the back of it. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found it useful.